Camille adjusted the collar of her judicial robe, the black fabric heavy against her shoulders, as she stood in the quiet of her chambers. The weight was not just physical, it was the burden of the role she had chosen, the responsibility to uphold justice in a system that often felt like it was teetering on the edge of fairness. Outside, the city of Fort Collins buzzed with its usual rhythm, students cycling to class, families strolling through Old Town, and the distant hum of traffic. But inside the courthouse the air was thick with anticipation, and for Camille it was personal. She had always believed in the power of the law to protect and serve, to be a beacon of hope for those who had none. As a black woman in a predominantly white judicial system, she had fought hard to earn her place on the bench. Her journey had been one of resilience, navigating skepticism and prejudice with a quiet strength that had become her hallmark. But the events of the past few months had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It had started with a routine day at the park. Camille had been there with her nephew, tossing a frisbee under the warm September sun, when two police officers approached. Their names, Carter and Daniels, were now seared into her memory. What began as a simple inquiry about a noise complaint escalated into a humiliating ordeal. The officers, skeptical of her explanation and emboldened by their authority, had handcuffed her in front of a growing crowd, accusing her of resisting arrest. The charges were baseless, dropped within hours, but the damage was done. The video of her arrest, captured by a bystander, had gone viral, sparking outrage and rallying the community to her side. Camille managed a small smile as she recalled the support that had poured in, letters, protests, and community meetings organized in her name. But that support was a double-edged sword. It empowered her, gave her the strength to keep going, but it also heightened the pressure. She couldn't let them down. The people of Fort Collins saw her as a symbol of resistance, a judge who could stand up to systemic injustice. The weight of their expectations was a constant presence, like a shadow trailing her every step. She had filed a lawsuit against officers Carter and Daniels, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. The incident wasn't just about her, it was about the countless others who had faced similar abuses of power and had no platform to fight back. Her attorney, a seasoned litigator named Marcus Reed, had warned her that the road ahead would be long and grueling. "They'll try to bury you in paperwork and delays," he had said, "but we'll keep pushing." Camille had nodded, her resolve unshaken. She was ready to fight. But then, just days ago, Marcus had called with news that turned her world upside down. "Camille," he said, his voice cautious over the phone, "you should know something else. You've been assigned as the judge for one of their cases next month." The irony was staggering. Camille leaned back in her chair, the phone still pressed to her ear as she processed the revelation. She had spent weeks preparing to face these officers in court as a plaintiff, to hold them accountable for their actions against her. And now, fate had handed her an entirely different kind of justice. She was to preside over a case involving Carter and Daniels, accused of excessive force in an unrelated incident. For a moment, she wondered if she could do it, if she could sit on that bench and remain impartial as her oath demanded. The question lingered as she prepared for the hearing. Could she separate her personal experience from her duty as a judge? The officers had humiliated her, treated her like a criminal despite her position, her education, her very identity as a servant of justice. But she also knew that the law demanded impartiality, and she had sworn to uphold it. The conflict churned within her, a storm of emotion she kept carefully contained. As she walked toward the courtroom, her heels clicking against the polished floor, Camille thought about the people depending on her. The community had rallied behind her, but they weren't just looking for a victory in her lawsuit. They wanted her to make a stand, to show that justice could prevail even when the system seemed stacked against it. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was an opportunity to demonstrate what real justice looked like. The courtroom was buzzing with quiet murmurs as people filed in, finding their seats. The case was an internal misconduct hearing, not particularly high profile, involving officers Carter and Daniels. They were accused of using excessive force during a traffic stop, an incident that had left a young man named Ethan battered and shaken. To most in the room, it was just another day in the justice system, a procedural matter that would likely end with a slap on the wrist for the officers. But for Camille, it was anything but routine. She stepped onto the bench, her robe flowing behind her, and took her seat. The room fell silent, all eyes on her. She glanced toward the defendant's table, where Carter and Daniels sat, their uniforms pressed and polished, their expressions indifferent, almost bored. They leaned toward each other, speaking in low tones, as if this were just another hurdle to clear, another case to brush aside. Then their eyes met hers. The reaction was immediate. Officer Carter's face drained of color, his eyes widening in shock, as if he'd seen a ghost. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching into fists on the table. They recognized her, the woman they had arrested, humiliated, and dismissed. Now, she was the one in control. Camille allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room. The silence was heavy, charged with the unspoken tension between her and the officers. Then, in a clear, steady voice, she began. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The officers sat stiffly, their composure faltering. Carter whispered something to their lawyer, who nodded but kept his focus on Camille. For the first time in weeks, she felt the upper hand. But she knew this wasn't about revenge. Her role as a judge demanded fairness, and she would uphold that standard, no matter how personal this felt. As the attorneys presented their opening arguments, Camille maintained her professionalism, listening intently and taking meticulous notes. The prosecutor outlined the allegations against the officers, detailing how they had tackled Ethan to the ground during a routine traffic stop, ignoring his compliance and escalating the situation unnecessarily. The defense, in turn, argued that the officers had acted in the heat of the moment, their actions driven by the need to maintain control in a potentially volatile situation. Camille's gaze flickered toward the officers every so often. She could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their hands fidgeted slightly. They were unraveling, bit by bit, under the weight of her presence. During a recess, she overheard snippets of their conversation as they stepped into the hallway, their voices low but agitated. "How is she the judge?" Carter hissed, his frustration barely contained. "This has to be a setup," Daniels muttered, shaking his head. "It's not a setup," their lawyer interjected, his tone sharp. "It's a coincidence, and you need to stay focused. She's not the enemy here. Your actions are." The officers didn't seem convinced, too consumed by the surreal nature of their predicament. But Camille wasn't swayed by their discomfort. She returned to the bench, her expression calm and composed, and resumed the hearing. Her presence alone seemed to unsettle the defendants, and every time she addressed them, they shifted in their seats, their confidence eroding. At one point, during witness testimony, Camille caught Carter stealing a glance at her. His expression wasn't defiance, it was something closer to regret, as if he was beginning to understand the gravity of what they had done. The moment passed, but it lingered in her mind. Could these men, who had wielded their authority so recklessly, truly grasp the harm they had caused? By the end of the day, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Camille adjourned the hearing, her gavel striking with finality. "We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m., she announced. As the room emptied, she lingered at her bench, organizing her notes. She could feel the weight of the officers' stares as they hesitated by the door, clearly debating whether to approach her. In the end, they didn't. They left quietly, their steps heavy with the realization that this was far from over. Camille sat alone in the courtroom, the silence settling around her like a cloak. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. She was judging the very men who had judged her, who had stripped her of her dignity in a public park. But the real challenge wasn't in the irony. It was in the decisions that would follow, the delicate balance between justice and impartiality. She had to remain fair, not just for the sake of the law, but for the people who believed in her, who saw her as a beacon of hope in a flawed system. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, Camille felt a flicker of resolve. This case wasn't just about Carter and Daniels, it was about Ethan, the young man they had harmed, and the countless others whose stories went unheard. It was about proving that justice could prevail, even when the odds seemed stacked against it. And for Camille, that was a fight worth having. The courtroom was packed the next morning, the air thick with anticipation. News of the unexpected twist, Judge Camille Harris presiding over a case involving the officers who had wrongfully arrested her, had spread like wildfire through Fort Collins. Reporters lined the back wall, their notebooks open, pens poised to capture every detail. Community members filled the seats, some there out of curiosity, others to support Camille. Though they knew her role as judge meant she could show no favoritism. The weight of their presence was both a comfort and a reminder of the stakes. Camille entered the courtroom with the same calm, composed demeanor she had maintained the previous day. Her robe flowed behind her as she ascended to the bench, her expression unreadable but commanding. She took her seat, her eyes briefly scanning the room before settling on the defendant's table, where officers Carter and Daniels sat. Their uniforms, once a symbol of authority, now seemed like a flimsy shield against the scrutiny they faced. Carter's face was pale, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, while Daniels shifted restlessly, his jaw tight. The attorneys wasted no time diving into their arguments. The prosecutor, a sharp and methodical woman named Lena Patel, laid out the evidence against the officers with precision. She presented testimony from witnesses who had seen the incident unfold, body camera footage that contradicted the officers' initial reports, and medical records documenting the injuries sustained by Ethan, the young man at the center of the case. "Your Honor," Patel said, her voice steady and commanding, "the officers' actions were not just a lapse in judgment. They were a blatant abuse of power. Their behavior reflects a pattern of disregard for the very people they are sworn to protect." Camille nodded, her pen gliding across her notepad as she took in every word. Her focus was unshakable, even as the defendants shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. The parallels between this case and her own experience were impossible to ignore. The excuses, the justifications, the dismissal of accountability. But she pushed her personal feelings aside, determined to let the facts guide her. The defense attorney, a seasoned litigator named Robert Klein, rose to counter. His tone was measured but strained, as if he knew the evidence was stacked against his clients. "Your Honor," he began, "while we acknowledge the incident in question, we argue that the situation escalated due to factors beyond the officers' control. Their intent was not malicious, and we believe this case lacks sufficient grounds for punitive measures." Camille listened intently, her expression neutral. Klein's argument was familiar, a playbook she had seen countless times in her years on the bench. It relied on painting the officers as victims of circumstance, caught in a high-pressure situation that left them no choice but to act. But the evidence told a different story, one of recklessness and disregard. When it was time for witness cross-examinations, the tension in the room deepened. Patel called Ethan to the stand. He was a slight young man, barely 20, with a nervous energy that filled the room as he took his seat. His voice trembled as he recounted the night of the incident, a routine traffic stop that had spiraled into chaos when Carter and Daniels pulled him over for a broken taillight. "They didn't even give me a chance to explain," Ethan said, his eyes darting nervously between the attorneys and the officers. "It felt like they decided I was guilty before I even opened my mouth." Patel pressed further. "And did you resist their orders at any point?" "No," Ethan replied firmly, his voice gaining strength. "I was scared, but I did everything they said. It didn't matter. They had already made up their minds." The room was silent as Klein stood to cross-examine. He tried to poke holes in Ethan's testimony, suggesting that his nervousness could have been interpreted as resistance, that the officers had acted out of an abundance of caution. But Ethan held his ground, his voice steady despite the pressure. Camille watched intently, her expression unreadable, but inside she felt a pang of recognition. Ethan's story mirrored her own in ways that were impossible to ignore. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The defendants were called to testify. Officer Carter was the first to take the stand, his hands trembling slightly as he swore the oath. He glanced nervously at Camille, his eyes betraying a mix of fear and defiance. "Officer Carter," Patel began, her tone sharp, "you've been accused of using excessive force in this incident. Can you explain your actions that night?" Carter hesitated, his gaze darting toward Daniels before he answered. "I thought the situation was escalating," he said, his voice shaky. "I made a judgment call." "And do you believe your actions were justified?" Patel pressed. Carter shifted in his seat. "At the time, yes, but looking back, I could have handled it differently." "Handled it differently how?" Patel asked, her voice cutting through the room. "By not tackling an unarmed, compliant individual to the ground?" Carter opened his mouth, but no words came out. His silence spoke volumes, and the room felt the weight of it. When it was Daniel's turn to testify, his demeanor was similarly strained. His attempts to justify his actions only deepened the prosecutor's case, highlighting his inability to take accountability. Camille listened closely, her face betraying no emotion. But inside, she felt a mixture of frustration and pity. These men had been given authority, yet they wielded it recklessly, leaving a trail of harm in their wake. Their testimony was a litany of excuses, each one weaker than the last, and it was clear that the evidence against them was overwhelming. As the day wore on, Patel's closing argument was powerful, urging the court to set a precedent that abuse of power would not be tolerated. Klein's closing statement, in contrast, was a desperate attempt to salvage his client's reputations, but it lacked conviction. Even Carter and Daniels seemed resigned to the likely outcome, their faces pale and drawn as they sat at the defense table. Camille adjourned the hearing, her voice steady as she announced that a ruling would be delivered the following week. As the courtroom emptied, the officers lingered near the exit, their expressions somber. For the first time, they seemed to grasp the gravity of their actions and the reality of what awaited them. Camille remained at her bench, her hands folded over her notes. The day had been grueling, but she felt a quiet sense of purpose. This case wasn't just about punishing two officers, it was about holding the system accountable, about ensuring that those who abused their power faced consequences. But it was also about something bigger, about proving that justice could be fair even when it was personal. As she left the courthouse that evening, Camille felt the weight of the day settle over her. She knew the ruling she would deliver would have ripple effects, not just for Carter and Daniels, but for the community watching her every move. The fight for justice was far from over, but for now, she had done her part. The morning of the ruling dawned crisp and clear, the autumn light filtering through the courthouse windows. The courtroom was silent as Camille entered, her robe a stark contrast against the polished wood of the bench. Every seat was filled, the tension almost tangible. Reporters lined the back wall, their pens poised, while community members sat shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on her. This was no longer just a case about two officers, it had become a symbol of a larger fight for justice and accountability. Camille took her seat, her expression calm but firm. She had spent the week deliberating, weighing the evidence against her oath to remain impartial. The parallels between this case and her own experience had haunted her, but she had pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the facts. The evidence was clear. Officers Carter and Daniels had acted with unnecessary force, disregarding the protocols they were sworn to uphold. But her ruling would need to balance punishment with the opportunity for reform, to show that justice was not just about retribution but about change. She began, her voice cutting through the silence. The role of law enforcement is to protect and serve the community with integrity, respect, and fairness. When those entrusted with this responsibility abuse their power, it erodes public trust and causes harm far beyond the immediate victim. This case has laid bare the consequences of such actions. She paused, her eyes scanning the room. Carter and Daniels sat at the defense table, their heads bowed, the weight of her words settling over them. The room was still, every breath held in anticipation. The evidence presented has demonstrated that Officers Carter and Daniels acted with unnecessary force, disregarding the protocols they were sworn to uphold, Camille continued. Their actions were not only unjustified, but indicative of a troubling pattern that must be addressed. She outlined the consequences: mandatory suspension without pay, participation in extensive retraining programs, and a formal disciplinary record that would follow them. The ruling was firm but fair, designed to hold them accountable while offering a path toward redemption. Camille knew that true change came through actions, not just punishment, and she wanted to give them a chance to prove they could do better. When she finished, she closed the case with a decisive gavel strike. "This court is adjourned." The officers stood, their expressions somber as they prepared to leave. Before exiting, Carter hesitated and turned to Camille. "Your Honor," he began, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. It wasn't enough to undo the harm, but it was a start." Camille nodded, acknowledging his words without offering absolution. True change, she knew, would come through actions, not apologies. As the courtroom emptied, Camille remained seated, taking a moment to reflect. The victory felt bittersweet. For every case like this, countless others went unspoken, unresolved. But this ruling was a step forward, a signal that the system could be held accountable, that change was possible. Later that evening, Camille attended a community meeting at a local recreation center. The room was filled with people eager to share their stories, their frustrations, their hopes. An older woman approached her after the meeting, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you," she said, gripping Camille's hand tightly. "What you did in that courtroom, it means the world to us." Camille smiled softly. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We have so much more work to do." The following week saw meaningful conversations between community leaders, law enforcement, and local activists. Camille used her platform to advocate for reforms, emphasizing the need for transparency and accountability in policing. The case had sparked a ripple effect, not just in Fort Collins, but across the state. People began demanding change, pushing for policies that prioritized fairness and equality. For Camille, the journey wasn't about personal vindication. It was about ensuring that others wouldn't have to endure what she had. The fight for justice was ongoing, but moments like this reminded her that change, though slow, was possible. As she stood on the steps of the courthouse that afternoon, watching a group of young activists gather for a peaceful rally, Camille felt a sense of hope. The system wasn't perfect, but with enough voices, it could be pushed toward progress. And that, she thought, was the kind of justice worth fighting for. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.